All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Now, today, before we get into the video, I would be remiss if I didn't put you on game here with the whole schizo-psycho normie dialectic or trialectic that's been going around. Now, Hyperborean Knowledge is the first channel that I kind of learned about this from, but we've also got here Hidden America, who breaks it down really good. And then when you're ready for the more advanced stuff, then you head up Schizo Dumps, right? So look at this meme here. When I'm saying schizo, a lot of people probably interpreting that as me actually saying schizophrenic, but that's not what it means. It's a meme that's going around that will actually, well, at least for me personally, it completely gave me an entirely new tool of analysis, of social analysis. And if you get it, you get it. And if you don't, you don't. I would definitely suggest watching Hyperborean Knowledge's video first, then Hidden America, and then you can jump into Schizo Dumps. But you can see here that, you might say, oh, this guy's schizophrenic. But basically, if you're listening to this channel and you're a conspiracy theorist, you are at least 50% schizo, right? Because a schizo is immune to propaganda, increased pattern recognition, the chosen ones, and socially rejected and stigmatized. And if that doesn't define a conspiracy theorist, I don't know what does. So basically, if you're a conspiracy theorist, you're at least 50% schizo. You might be a schizo-psycho, especially the more popular people, because psycho, skilled at manipulating and influencing others, creates the current thing, treats others as livestock, blinded by hubris. So, that's like kind of, not saying it's a negative characteristic always, but it definitely will lead you to the top, in the influencer sphere, on YouTube, on X, places like that, right? And if you're a conspiracy theorist, it means you're immune to propaganda, increased pattern recognition. So you could say that a lot of the top conspiracy theorists are probably schizo-psychos. Probably more people that follow conspiracy theorists are probably either pure schizo or schizo normies, right? And you could switch them around too, right? So it's like, you got your psycho schizos and you got your schizo psychos, right? Where I think I fall more into the category of a schizo psycho, where I'm like more schizo, but I could go psycho if I was pushed in the wrong direction. But I'm like 0.001%. I'm like as much normie as African DNA is in every white person's 23andMe. Like it's like 0.0001% normie. And I'm like probably like 90% schizo and like 10% psycho. Right. And, he's breaking it down how you can look at every movie like in these terms, and it's amazing, right? Because I was like thinking the other day, like Terminator is the perfect example of the trichotomy here, where it's like Kyle Reese was the schizo. He's the guy that comes back and he has all the information. He knows exactly what's gonna happen next because he's coming back from the future, and then Sarah Connor is the normie, right? She's like, I don't believe a word you say. You're nuts. You're like, the psycho Terminator is coming to get you. As Hyperborean Knowledge says, he's coming to clap those cheeks. And the schizo spends 45 minutes of the movie trying to convince the normie that the psycho's coming to clap those cheeks. And the normie does not believe the schizo until literally the psycho walks through 4 walls of the police station and kills 40 police in the police station and is in her face, ready to kill her. And then she's like, oh, now I get what you were saying. Now I get what you were saying about the schizo, the psycho coming to clap those cheeks, right? So it's like a whole other level of social analysis. It doesn't mean you're schizophrenic, because if you're a conspiracy theorist, you are a schizo. That's just how it works. because you're immune to propaganda and you have increased pattern recognition and you're socially rejected or isolated, right? You could be psycho-schizo, you could be schizo-psycho. If you're at the level where you're creating content, you're probably like less than 1% normie. Your followers are probably schizo normies. Most of your followers, if you create content, most of your followers are either schizo normies or normie or schizo curious normies, right? So that's the breakdown of that. Again, check out those channels. And we're going to get into the book here. Okay. Sorry about that. Nuclear Rivalry and the Cold War, 1950 to 1957. We're on page 1073. The Agrarian Law of September 1952 determined much of the subsequent political and economic policy of the region. It sought to alleviate the plight of the peasant and to force the landlord group, the center of Egyptian wealth, to shift their holdings from land to investment in industry and commerce. This was expected to create jobs for the numerous unemployed of the cities and to increase the Egyptian sector in trade, which was still largely in foreign hands. The original law set a maximum of land ownership at 315 acres for each family, with 210 for the head of the family and a quarter as much for each of the first two children. Land beyond this amount had to be sold to the peasants who were actually working it at a price 70 times the annual land tax in plots of 2 to 5 acres. If not sold thus in 6 weeks, the surplus was taken by the state in return for 30-year 3% bonds and was then sold to the peasants on long-term payments by the state. Since the peasants' cultivation, whether as laborer, renter, or sharecropper, had previously been strictly regulated by the owner, this regulatory function was, under the new law, taken over by cooperative societies which were made compulsory in each district. These societies also act as purchasing, marketing, and training cooperatives. The law also enacted a reduction in rents for peasants who rented the lands. Several years later, the maximum limit for land ownership was reduced to 52.5 acres per person. The agrarian reform undoubtedly helped the peasants who obtained ownership of plots or those whose rents were reduced, but it did nothing about the landless laborers or the growing mass of persons with no economic role who were multiplying so rapidly from the population explosion. The older landlord class, even on a 50-acre maximum, was adequately provided for, but the method of compensation for their confiscated lands did not give them the free capital which it had been hoped would expand industry and trade. Moreover, few had sufficient confidence in the economic future of Egypt or the regime itself to put much of their current incomes into such activities, especially as the Nasser government took over many of the largest and most prosperous industrial enterprises. As a result, the government itself had increasingly to create new enterprises from government funds, and the system, although committed to a mixed economy, increasingly had to move towards socialism. It was clear from the beginning that the only remedy for the population explosion was additional land, and it was equally clear that this could be achieved only if the waters of the Nile were spread widely and more effectively over the uncultivated periphery of the Nile Valley. For this purpose, the Nasser government proposed a high dam 3 miles south of Aswan between the first cataract of the Nile and the Sudan frontier. The project was technically feasible, but enormously expensive and involved complex political problems. The proposed dam, 3 miles long and 120 yards high, would back up a reservoir of about 130 billion cubic meters of water, much of it in Sudan territory, and displacing 60,000 inhabitants, as well as submerging many archaeological treasures. The project, originally estimated to cost over $1 billion, would increase Egypt's farmlands by about 30%, or 2 million acres, and by equalizing the flow of the Nile throughout the year, would steady the country's whole system of agricultural production. If the flow of water from the reservoir were harnessed to generate electricity, it could yield 10,000 million kilowatts hours, but this would drive the total cost up to about 4 billion over 15 years. Such a project could not possibly be financed by Egypt itself and cannot be built without previous agreement with Sudan. Such an agreement must modify an earlier compromise of 1929, which gave Egypt 48,000 million cubic meters of water and the Sudan only 4,000 million cubic meters out of the total Nile flow of 84,000 million cubic meters, leaving 32,000 million cubic meters which previously flowed to the sea to be divided from the new high dam reservoir. From the beginning, it should have been clear to Nasser that his regime would be a success only if he found a solution to Egypt's economic plight, and that the most substantial contribution to such a solution would come from the high dam. Such a dam could be built only with financial assistance of the West, since the Soviet bloc lacked the free resources or psychological outlook to do the job. And a dam of that size, 17 times the mass of the Pyramid of Cheops, could not be built by Egypt's own resources soon enough to alleviate Egypt's economy. If Nasser had concentrated on this problem and determined to retain relations with the United States sufficiently amicable to obtain the necessary American aid, some progressive solution of the problems of Egypt and the Near East might have been possible. However, Nasser allowed himself to be distracted by all kinds of emotional upheavals of an unconstructive kind. He maintained a constant state of hatred and tension towards Israel. He insisted on heavy armaments Egypt neither needed nor could afford, and which Egyptians lacked the skill and the morale to use. He kept Egyptians and the whole Arab world in an uproar by his incendiary speeches and actions and his continual political intrigues and interventions in a fantastic and needless effort to make himself the leader of Arab political movements all the way from Morocco and Lake Chad to the Persian Gulf and Alexandretta. And he insisted on demonstrating his independence of the West by constant attacks and insults directed at the United States. The United States, in the Dulles era, contributed to this confusion by its mistaken idea that the Soviet Union was actively engaging in efforts to take over the Near East, and by Dulles's efforts to force all the countries of the area into a single defensive pact, like the Baghdad Pact. Dulles's contribution to the confusion in the Near East, as elsewhere, was that he refused to see that the problems of the primary concern to the local peoples were local problems, and that these were merely worsened by his insistence that the only problem in the area was the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union. When the United States rejected Nasser's tentative request for heavy weapons, Nasser went to the Soviet bloc with his demands and obtained a large part of his requests, far beyond his real needs, but on a barter arrangement which tied up the Egyptian cotton crops for years in the future and removed this major prop of Egypt's economy out of the economic picture. Without cotton to sell for foreign exchange, Nasser could not hope to ameliorate Egypt's immediate economic problems. At the same time, while filling the air with denunciations of the United States and threats to Israel, Nasser opened his discussion for the financial assistance necessary to construct the high dam. When the International Bank, as well as the American government, agreed to contribute to the project in principle but insisted on certain necessary precautions, such as the right to scrutinize the accounts, Nasser tried to blackmail them by playing off the United States against Soviet Russia by circulating stories of Soviet offers to build the project. In the meantime, Nasser was engaged in intensive intrigues against the three Arab dynasties of Iraq, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, all of whom were linked to the West. To increase their local popular support, these dynasties had to adopt policies more independent of the West or even anti-Western in order to avoid the subversive influence on their subjects of Nasser's wild talk about independence from the West. Most of these anti-Western actions took the form of anti-British actions. One of the chief of these was the dismissal by King Hussein of Jordan of General Sir John Glubb, the so-called Glubb Pasha, who had trained and commanded the Jordanian Arab Legion for many years. This dismissal in March 1956 left Jordan in a state of semi-dissolution and in grave danger of being partitioned by its Arab neighbors, Iraq, Egypt, Arabia. Since the Arab Legion was one of the chief supports of the dynasty, it also gravely jeopardized British influence in Jordan. To counteract this, the British tried to shift Iraqi troops from Iraq, where the government of Nur al-Said was still friendly to Britain, to Jordan, where they could be used to support King Hussein and perhaps be used to prevent the anticipated pro-Nasser and anti-British outcome of the Jordan election of October 1956. For the same reason, the British Prime Minister, Sir Anthony Eden, adopted an increasingly anti-Israel attitude which culminated late in 1955 when he suggested that the Israeli frontier be redrawn to give some disputed areas to Jordan. Since Israel was already under great threat from both Egypt and Jordan, it continued to rearm in 1956 and made perfectly clear that it would oppose in any way it could any union of the Arab states and especially any move to unite the Iraq and Jordan armed forces or to put them under Egyptian command. In this tense situation, Dulles, suddenly upset by the balance by withdrawing the United States' offer of financial aid for the Aswan Dam. This decision of July 19, 1956 was answered on July 26th, 4th anniversary of the expulsion of King Farouk by Nasser, with the sudden nationalization of the Suez Canal Company so that its profits could be used by Egypt to finance the high dam. July to October 1956 was a period of mounting crisis in the Near East, as all the principal states concerned mishandled the difficult situation with gross incompetence. There can be no doubt that Egypt had the right to nationalize an Egyptian corporation such as the Suez Canal Company, and the only concern of the outside world was the twofold one that the owners of record be adequately compensated and that the transit operations through the canal be efficiently conducted for all shipping. From the beginning, the British took their stand on other grounds, maintaining incorrectly that the company was not an Egyptian corporation but an international organization, that the Egyptians could not operate it at all, and that Britain would use force, if necessary, to prevent Nasser from obtaining control of the canal. France supported Britain chiefly because it wished to strike at Nasser for his assistance to the anti-French rebels, the FLN, in Algeria. Israel supported these two, while following a completely independent policy because it was increasingly convinced that its survival as a state depended on its ability to break out of the growing encirclement of Arab states. You could have did that by moving to New Jersey, too. Dulles, having precipitated the crisis, sought to placate both sides, refusing to support Britain's arguments, yet unwilling to abandon it in public. Accordingly, as usual, Dulles spent most of his efforts trying to find some verbal formula which would gloss over the differences. Though he refused to support Britain and France for fear this would drive Nasser towards Moscow, he was unable to support the Arab states because he needed France and Britain in the American struggle with the Soviet Union. As a result, his ambivalent and changeable actions and statements alienated both sides. While the controversy raged in public, in secret conferences, and at the United Nations, the canal continued to operate with about a third of the dues, including those of American ships, being paid to the new Egyptian Canal Authority and the rest going to the old company. The British insisted that the Egyptians were incapable of operating the canal, and to prove the point, recalled all British-controlled pilots and technical operators on September 15, 1956, and at the same time challenged the effectiveness of the new administration by presenting a large number of English and French ships for passage. This attempt was based on biased information accepted by Whitehall from the old Suez Company. It proved, in fact, to be wide of the mark, for the remaining Egyptian pilots successfully conducted 50 ships through the canal in one day. Substitute pilots were obtained at very high wages by advertising throughout the world. The solution of this technical problem left only the second problem: compensation to the former owners. Because Egypt had the funds to make payment, the practical and legal crisis should have been ended, but Britain and France were still determined to force Egypt to accept some type of international control of the canal, and many in both countries were determined to humiliate Nasser and bring about his downfall in order to end his intriguing against the two former imperial powers in the Arab world, especially in the oil-rich Near East and Algeria. For this reason, the two old allies continued to press for an international canal authority and to prepare their own armed forces in the Near East to compel internationalization. While conferences were still going on in the United Nations and elsewhere, the showdown was precipitated somewhat earlier than London and perhaps Paris had expected by Israel. During the Suez Crisis, the quite separate problem of Israel had become more intense, with increasingly frequent Arab raids on Israel and more violent Israeli reprisals. The situation was made more complex by French support and rearmament for Israel in the face of continued British support for Jordan and Iraq. Israel felt certain that a complete victory for Nasser in the canal crisis would encourage him to organize a general attack on Israel. Nasser's troublemaking proclivities, even during the canal crisis, were revealed when the French captured an Egyptian ship smuggling 70 tons of arms to the Algerian rebels on October 18th. 2 days before, a secret Anglo-French conference in Paris discussed the situation and probably decided that the two great powers would intervene by an attack on Egypt under the pretext of restoring order if an Arab-Israeli war began. They probably expected this movement sometime in November and were not fully ready when it began on October 29th. The Jordan election of October 21, 1956, was a victory for the anti-Western, pro-Nasser activist parties pledged to revise the Anglo-Jordan alliance. 2 days later, Egyptian and Syrian military missions arrived in Jordan, and at once set up a joint Egyptian-Jordanian-Syrian military command with an Egyptian designated as commander-in-chief for any future hostilities with Israel. On the same day began the Soviet armed intervention in Hungary to repress the Budapest insurrection. On the following day, Egyptian raiders began to penetrate into Israel, and Israel's mobilization began. 4 days later, on the 29th, Israel attacked Egypt and at once began a spectacular advance across the Sinai Desert towards the Suez Canal and Cairo. The 9 days Israel-Sinai campaign was a brilliant military success. Individual Egyptians and small units often fought fiercely, but the command was incompetent, morale was almost totally absent, and training was equally bad. Whole units fled like sheep, and much of the newly acquired heavy equipment was abandoned unused. On October 30th, a joint Anglo-French ultimatum was set up to Israel and Egypt, ordering them to stop all warlike action, to withdraw their forces at least 10 miles from the canal, and to permit a temporary occupation of 3 canal points, Port Said, Ismailia, and Suez, by Anglo-French forces. Israel accepted the ultimatum until it was clear that Egypt would not. The latter was attacked by British planes shortly after the ultimatum expired on October 31st, but Allied paratroops did not drop before November 5th, and the seaborne Anglo-French invasion of Egypt did not begin until November 6th. The United States Department of State was wild with rage at what it regarded as British perfidy and Anglo-Israeli collusion to engage in war outside the Western alliance and collective security system, actions which had always seemed acceptable to Dulles if applied by the United States to the Formosa Strait or other areas of primary American concern. On October 30th, Dulles tried to force through the Security Council of the United Nations a resolution condemning Israel and asking all United Nations members to cut off military, economic, or financial assistance to Israel. This was killed by Anglo-French vetoes 7-2. Britain, the Commonwealth, and the London Cabinet itself were badly split, while world opinion was strongly against the use of force by any state. In London, 2 ministers resigned, and others threatened to do so. On November 2nd, the Assembly of the United Nations, by its largest majority to date, accepted by a vote of 64-5 a Dulles resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in the Near East. Egypt and Israel accepted on November 5th, while the Anglo-French forces stopped their advance the following day, 23 miles south of Port Said. The Israel forces were already across Sinai. Of more permanent significance, the petroleum pipelines and pumping stations bringing oil to Levantine seaports across Syria were destroyed, and a number of block ships sunk by Egypt in the canal had cut off all Near Eastern oil supplies to Western Europe by the direct routes. Most important of all, the parallel American-Soviet threats of France and England and the simultaneous Soviet attack on Hungary had made permanent splits in the 2 great superpower blocs and had given a greatly increased impetus to the growth of an independent third bloc between them. This development of an increasingly independent buffer fringe between the 2 disintegrating superblocks became the outstanding feature of the next 7 years of world history under the awesome canopy of the Soviet-American missile and space race 1956 to 1963. Liquidation of the Suez Crisis was not completed until the end of 1958, but in the interval, the continued confusion of the whole Near East almost totally concealed the process of liquidation. Much of this confusion arose from inept handling by the Western powers of the very real problems of the area. These problems were four in number. 1. The economic poverty of the area, especially the food crisis in Egypt. 2. The Israel issue. 3. The decline of British power leading to political instability. And 4. The challenge of the French position in Muslim North Africa, especially in Algeria. The decline in British and French influence was a consequence of World War II, and especially of the decisions of the British and French peoples to devote their wealth to social welfare rather than to efforts to retain their imperial positions. This left a power vacuum, as the Arab states were obviously unable to maintain order in the area or even govern themselves, and neither the United States nor the Soviet Union was willing to move into the almost insoluble problem of maintaining political stability in the area or to allow the other superpower to make the effort to do so. Britain made feeble efforts to retain its influence in Jordan, Iraq, southern Arabia, and the Persian Gulf. In the case of Jordan and Iraq, at least, this was not worth the effort and was doomed to failure, as became clear with the expulsion of Glubb Pasha in March 1956 and the overthrow of the Iraq monarchy of Nuri al-Said in July 1958. American policy in the Near East was based on a series of assumptions which were so remote from the truth that no successful policy could be based on them. These were: 1. That the Near East was an area in which the Soviet Union had plans for immediate penetration and subversion in order to communize it. 2. That the Arab world was a unified bloc with significant intrinsic power of its own, which would join the Soviet bloc, or at least contribute to increase its strength, if not constantly placated by concessions. 3. That no policy of neutralism of the Near East was feasible or acceptable to the West. And 4. That the public opinion of the masses of Arab peoples was of some significance in the formulation of policy in the Arab states. And 5. That the arming of the Arab states would contribute to their ability to resist Soviet penetration and to the political stability of the area. All 5 of these assumptions were untrue. The Soviet Union had no significant plans to communize, to subvert, or to penetrate the Near East after 1948, and was eager to see it become a stable and neutral area in order to deprive the United States of any excuse to intervene there. Moreover, the Arab states were neither united nor strong, but were diverse, filled with mutual hatreds and petty jealousies, and almost totally incapable of acting as a bloc, even when their primary interests were threatened. In fact, their only common interests were hatred of Israel, desire to be independent and neutral, and the desire for economic handouts without any accompanying political commitments from anyone who would give them. The public opinion of the Arab peoples described in the previous sentence was of little influence in the face of the concentration of local political power in the hands of the local armed forces, which were, with perhaps the exception of Nasser himself, corruptible. Efforts to arm these forces against a non-existent Soviet arms threat contributed nothing to their ability to defend the area itself, and merely increased their corruption, their economic burden on the people, and the political instability of the area by increasing their abilities to threaten each other or Israel. Dulles' policies in the Near East were consistently the opposite of what they should have been. No possible alliance or rearming of the Arab states could have contributed anything to the area's ability to resist communism, nor could the Arab states have contributed anything but headaches to the Kremlin if Washington's policies had driven them into the arms of Russia. Overall, defense of the area should have been based on Ethiopia, Israel, and Turkey. The Arab states should have been given their independence, neutrality, and economic aid they wanted. The latter should have been concentrated on the Aswan Dam and the Jordan Valley Authority, similar to the Tennessee Valley Authority, for the mutual benefit of Jordan, Israel, and Syria, in return for the Arab states' acceptance of 1. A peace treaty with Israel, 2. Resettlement of the Arab refugees from the Israeli war on the new agricultural lands provided by the Jordan Valley Project. And finally, the United States should have declared unilaterally that it would use any force necessary to prevent any Soviet intrusion into the Near East or any attack on the independence of Israel. As a supplementary but probably unachievable project, the United States should have sought a pooling of the enormous oil revenues of the whole Near East to provide funds for the economic reconstruction of the area as whole within the framework of an Arab economic community based on free trade and free immigration within the Arab world. Instead, some Instead of some such progressive solution of the Near East problem and Suez crisis, the United States, acting through the United Nations, sought to restore the basically precarious status quo ante bellum without any guarantees. The real difficulty was Israel, which refused for several months to yield up the areas it had occupied without obtaining in return some solution of its grievances. These grievances were 1. The refusal of the Arab states to make a peace treaty or to accept the existence of Israel by ending the War of 1948. 2. The Arab economic, social, and political blockade of Israel, which included boycotts of all world business firms which did business with Israel. And 3. The denial of the Suez Canal to Israeli ships or identifiable Israeli goods since 1948. 4. Constant harassment of Israeli shipping or fishing on the Gulf of Aqaba and the Jordan River. And 5. The use of the Gaza Strip, non-Egyptian territory occupied by Egypt under the 1948 armistice, as a basis for guerrilla raids on Israel. Okay. Eventually, American pressure and world public opinion, acting through the United Nations, forced Israel to give up the territory it had captured, including the Gaza Strip and the Gulf of Aqaba shores, without any significant guarantees. A UN emergency force, UNEF, was sent to supervise the evacuation of Egyptian territory and the Gaza Strip under pressure of severe economic and financial threats of an unofficial nature from Washington. The effectiveness of such threats rested on the fact that the whole Israeli economy was dependent on the flow of private funds from the United States, while the British attack on Egypt had been abandoned very largely as a consequence of the drain on British dollar and gold reserves, which fell from $420 million in September to November 1956. The American threats of sanctions against its own friends and allies over Egypt at the time when it was doing nothing to impose sanctions for the Soviet attack on Hungary, and its refusal to cooperate with the Soviet Union in stabilizing the Near East because of Hungary, presented a strange picture of political fantasy as 1956 ended. One of the methods of pressure used by the United States against the Western powers was support of Egypt's refusal to allow any clearance of the Suez Canal until the withdrawal of troops from Egypt. This, of course, intensified the shortage of Near Eastern fuel oil in Europe as winter deepened. The evacuation of Anglo-French forces on December 22, 1956, and of Israeli forces on March 8, 1957, permitted clearing of the canal and the reimposition of Egyptian blockade pressures on Israel. In the interval, the American position, ignoring all the real problems of the area, was stated in the form of the so-called Eisenhower Doctrine in January 1957. Regarding the problem solely in terms of military opposition to communism, this doctrine attacked the Soviet Union and threatened to use the armed forces of the United States to defend any freedom-loving nations of the area, requesting such aid against overt armed aggression from any nation controlled by international communism. In reply to this unconstructive promise, the Soviet Union in February 1957 suggested a joint effort by four powers, Russia, the United States, Britain, and France, to reorganize the Near East on the basis of six principles. Peaceful settlement of all disputes there. 2. Non-interference in international affairs. 3. Renunciations of all efforts to incorporate Near Eastern countries into military blocs or of great powers. 4. Removal of foreign military bases from the area and the troops based on them. 5. A reciprocal ban on arms deliveries. And 6. Promotion of economic development without political or military entanglements. This promising Soviet offer, which might have been negotiated into some settlement of the Near East's real problems, was rebuffed by the United States. Instead, the Eisenhower Doctrine, in spite of the clear lack of any overt communist threat, was used against Egypt and Syria in regard to Jordan and Lebanon. The Jordan monarchy was completely dependent upon the army, which was, in turn, completely dependent upon financial subsidy from Britain. This subsidy, amounting to £12 million a year, was ended by the new parliament elected in October 1956. Syria and Saudi Arabia, which already had troops on Jordanian soil, joined with Egypt to continue the subsidy. To escape from growing Egyptian and Soviet influence, King Hussein dismissed his prime minister and sought aid from Washington. Rioting from opposition groups led to martial law, a $10 million grant under the Eisenhower Doctrine, and movement of the American Sixth Fleet to the Levant to support Hussein, October 1957. The rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Egypt for influence in the other Arab countries was marked by an Egypt-Syria economic union in September 1957 and $112 million loan from Syria to the Soviet bloc. And in February 1957, the union of these two countries into a united Arab Republic. Iraq and Jordan responded to this with a very ephemeral Arab Federation. By the spring of 1958, Nasser was engaged in controversies with all his neighboring states except Syria. A military coup by pro-Nasser officers in Iraq in July abolished the monarchy and assassinated Nuri al-Said and his chief supporters and threatened to overthrow the insecure government of President Shimon of Lebanon. To prevent this, American forces were landed in Lebanon in the same week, July 15th to 17th, in which the United Nations Commission on the spot reported a total lack of evidence of any outside forces trying to subvert Lebanon. On the following day, Hussein of Jordan asked and obtained a British parachute brigade to protect his position. Once again, Khrushchev appealed for a great power conference, this time to include India on the Near East, but was met by a series of evasions and logistical obstacles from Washington. The United States refused to act outside the United Nations, and the suggestion finally ended in a series of recriminatory letters in August. A special session of the United Nations Assembly sent Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, I don't know who that is, on a mission to the Near East, which was able to evacuate the troops from Lebanon and Jordan by November 1958. This turmoil in the Muslim states continued during the subsequent period of Soviet-American missile rivalry, 1956 to 1963. The United Arab Republic of Egypt and Syria, established in February 1958, was broken by Syria after a military coup had overturned the Syrian government in September 1961. Another Syrian military revolt early in 1963 announced its reestablishment, but internal opposition, chiefly from the Ba'ath Party, prevented this. In Iraq, the military revolt of July 1958, led by General Abdul Karim Qasim, remained in power on a relatively pro-communist and anti-Nasser basis until it was overthrown in a bloody military upheaval on February 8th through 9th, 1963. All right. That's the end of that section, which was nuclear rivalry and the Cold War, 1950 to 1957. I think we're on page 1087 is going to be the start of the next chapter. I'm just going to stop reading here for today so I don't get into the next chapter. The next chapter is going to be chapter 19, The New Era, 1957 to 1964. Hopefully this is kind of more philosophical or something like that. I don't know. A lot of dates, a lot of names, but as we can see, Egypt was correct in their analysis that they were going to need more weapons to protect themselves from Israel, and that Israel wasn't just going to do a peace treaty with them. And people are like, well, you're not going to need all those weapons. Israel's a tiny little country over there. They're the greatest country in the world. They're so peaceful. Don't worry about it, man. All they want to do is get some cream cheese for their bagels and some lox. They're never going to do a war. You don't need weapons. Why would you even think that? But it kind of seems like they were right, though, that they did need some more weapons. So, I don't know. It's just a historical take on it. All right. I'm going to get out of here with that. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this anyway. So, have a good day and peace.